To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we must first understand the height from which the world was about to fall. The year is 180 AD, and the Roman Empire is not merely a political entity, it is the entire known world, or at least the only part of it that mattered to those living within its borders. From the rain-swept heather of the Scottish Highlands to the burning sands of the Syrian desert, and from the dark forests of the Rhine to the Atlantic coast of Lusitania, a single law, a single currency, and a single administration bound 70 million people together. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative stability and prosperity that had lasted for roughly 2 centuries. It was an era where a merchant could travel from Alexandria to London on paved roads without fear of brigands, protected by the terrifying reputation of the legions stationed on the frontiers. The city of Rome itself was the beating heart of this colossus, a metropolis of over 1 million souls living amidst architectural wonders that projected an aura of eternal invincibility. To a citizen looking out over the 7 hills in the spring of 180 AD, it would have seemed impossible that this structure could ever crack, let alone shatter. The empire was not just a kingdom of gold in terms of wealth, but in terms of the human condition, representing the zenith of ancient organizational power. This stability was not an accident of history, nor was it solely the result of military might. It was the product of a unique political anomaly, known as the era of the 5 good emperors. For nearly a century, the greatest weakness of the monarchy, the genetic lottery of hereditary succession, had been effectively suspended. Beginning with Nerva in 96 AD, power was not passed from father to biological son, but from a ruler to the most capable man he could find. Trajan, the soldier who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, was adopted. He, in turn, adopted Hadrian, the administrator who toured the provinces and built the walls that defined the empire's limits. Hadrian adopted the steady hand of Antoninus Pius, who reigned over a period of such profound peace that it almost bored the historians. This meritocratic adoption system ensured that the throne was occupied by men who were groomed for leadership, schooled in administration, and tempered by experience before they ever wore the purple. It created a continuity of competence that allowed the bureaucracy to flourish and the economy to boom. The Senate, while diminished in absolute power, was treated with respect, and the army was kept under strict discipline. It was a golden age of governance, where the emperor was viewed not as a god-king to be feared, but as the princeps, the first citizen, working tirelessly for the good of the res publica. The last of these great guardians was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. Yet his reign was not one of idle luxury. By 180 AD, Marcus had spent the better part of a decade on the bleak northern frontiers, waging a brutal, grinding war against the Marcomanni and Quadi tribes. He was a man of profound contradiction, a student of Stoic philosophy who preached the brotherhood of man, yet was forced by duty to command legions in the slaughter of barbarians. In his private journals, which we now know as the Meditations, he wrote to himself not as an emperor, but as a man struggling to find quiet amidst the chaos. He reminded himself that everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. He served as the living embodiment of the Stoic ideal, duty above desire, reason above emotion, and the acceptance of nature's will. Under his rule, the cracks in the empire were beginning to show. Plague had ravaged the population, and the frontiers were under constant pressure. But the structure held because the man at the top was made of iron will and moral rectitude. He was the dam holding back the floodwaters of anarchy, sacrificing his own health and happiness to maintain the Pax Romana for one more day, one more year. But wisdom does not guarantee a wise legacy. As Marcus Aurelius lay dying in his military camp near distinct Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, he made the one decision that would undo a century of progress. Unlike his predecessors, Marcus had a living biological son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus. Whether blinded by paternal love or fearful of the civil war that might erupt if he bypassed his own bloodline, Marcus chose Commodus as his heir, ending the meritocratic adoption system that had saved Rome. On March 17, 180 A.D., Marcus Aurelius died, and with him died the philosophy that governance was a burden of duty. The contemporary historian Cassius Dio, who lived through the horrors that followed, famously wrote that upon Marcus's death, our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. This was not merely a change in leadership, it was a fundamental severing of the empire's moral artery. We are standing at the precipice of a terrifying transformation. The story we are about to tell is how a single man, through incompetence, paranoia, and megalomania, dismantled the Pax Romana and ignited the crisis of the 3rd century, plunging the world into a chaos from which it would never truly recover. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we must first understand the extraordinary anomaly that preceded it. For nearly 80 years, the Roman Empire had flourished under a unique political accident that historians would later idealize as the adoptive succession. From Nerva to Marcus Aurelius, power was not transferred through the chaotic genetic lottery of bloodlines, but through the deliberate selection of the most capable man for the job. It appeared to be a triumph of meritocracy, a system where the best man was chosen to guide the world's greatest superpower. Under these 5 good emperors, the borders were secure, the administration was efficient, and the law was respected. However, this golden chain of succession was held together by a fragile biological reality. None of Marcus's 4 predecessors had a biological son who survived to adulthood. They adopted heirs because they had no other choice. This streak of biological misfortune for the emperors was a stroke of immense fortune for the empire, shielding Rome from the whims of spoiled dynastic heirs. But in 161 A.D., that luck ran out. When Marcus Aurelius took the throne, he did so with a young son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, growing up in the imperial nursery. For the first time in a century, the empire faced the dangerous prospect of a boy born not to earn the throne, but to inherit it as a divine right. The pivotal moment, the point of no return, arrived in 177 A.D. Breaking with the tradition that had secured the Pax Romana, Marcus Aurelius elevated his 16-year-old son to the rank of Augustus, making Commodus his co-emperor and undeniable successor. Historians have long wrestled with this decision, often criticizing the philosopher-king for a lapse in judgment that would doom his people. How could a man who wrote the Meditations, a stoic masterpiece on duty and reason, hand the reins of the world to a boy who had shown little aptitude for governance? The harsh reality was that Marcus Aurelius found himself trapped in a dynastic corner. Unlike his predecessors, he had a living son. In the brutal calculus of Roman politics, to pass over Commodus in favor of a capable general would have been a death sentence for the boy. No new emperor could sit securely on the throne while the son of the beloved Marcus Aurelius lived. Commodus would have become a lightning rod for rebellion and civil war. Marcus chose paternal love and the hope of stability over the uncertainty of a meritocratic choice. By crowning Commodus in 177, he was attempting to secure an uncontested transition, praying that the weight of the purple and the guidance of wise counselors would mold the teenager into a ruler worthy of the name. It was a gamble made by a loving father, but it was one that the empire would pay for in blood. Commodus was a creature of a different world than his father. Born in the purple Porphyrogenitus, he was the first emperor in over a century to have been born, while his father was already reigning. He never knew the striving of a subject or the discipline of a soldier climbing the ranks. His reality from infancy was one of absolute deference. His every whim was law, and his every mistake was applauded by sycophants looking to curry favor. Marcus Aurelius, acutely aware of the dangers of such an upbringing, attempted to counteract the corrupting influence of the palace by surrounding his son with the greatest minds of the age. He hired the finest tutors in rhetoric, philosophy, and law, desperate to instill the stoic virtues that guided his own life. But the education failed to take root. Commodus was not intellectually curious. He was physical, visceral, and hedonistic. He found the droning lectures of philosophers to be torture, preferring the visceral thrill of the arena and the adoration of the crowd. While Marcus spent his nights by candlelight near the Danube, writing about the suppression of desire and the acceptance of death, Commodus was growing up in the lap of Roman luxury, learning that desire was to be indulged and that he was the center of the universe. The pressure of living in the shadow of a living saint, a father viewed by the world as the perfect human being, likely fractured the young man's psyche. Unable to compete with his father's intellect or moral standing, Commodus retreated into a world of physical prowess and megalomania, preparing to unleash his insecurities upon the world the moment the old man died. On March 17th, 180 A.D., the soul of the empire seemed to vanish into the gray mists of the Danube alongside the smoke of Marcus Aurelius's funeral pyre. For the legions stationed at Vindobona and Sirmium, the grief was compounded by a steely resolve. They had spent over a decade bleeding in the mud and forests of Germania, grinding the Marcomanni and Quadi tribes into submission. The war was all but won. The grand strategy, meticulously crafted by Marcus and his senior generals over years of grueling campaigns, was on the verge of fruition. The annexation of these hostile lands into two new Roman provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia. This would have pushed the imperial border from the Danube to the mountain ranges of Bohemia, shortening the defensive line and permanently neutralizing the threat to Italy. The soldiers, hardened veterans who had sacrificed their youth for this vision, looked to their new 19-year-old emperor, expecting him to give the order to finish the conquest. They expected Commodus to honor his father's legacy by driving the final nail into the coffin of the barbarian resistance. Instead, they watched with growing unease as the young man turned his gaze not toward the dark forests of the north, but toward the warm, seductive south. The tension inside the imperial command tent was palpable. A silent war fought between the wisdom of the old guard and the petulance of the new master. Commodus, who had spent his time at the front miserable and longing for the comforts of the capital, had no interest in the grim realities of border warfare. To the shock of the senior staff, particularly his brother-in-law and chief advisor, Claudius Pompeianus, Commodus proposed an immediate cessation of hostilities. He argued that the war was too costly, the winters too harsh, and the enemy too elusive, yet his advisors saw through the excuses. They knew he simply wanted to return to the gladiatorial games, the baths, and the sycophants of Rome. Pompeianus reportedly pleaded with the boy, warning him that a hasty withdrawal would look like a flight from the enemy, a sign of weakness that the tribes would inevitably exploit. He argued that leaving the job unfinished would render the thousands of Roman deaths meaningless. But Commodus, empowered by the absolute authority of the purple and surrounded by a new clique of flatterers who encouraged his laziness, dismissed the council of Rome's greatest military minds. He chose the path of least resistance, deciding that the glory of conquest was not worth the inconvenience of camp life. The peace treaty that followed was a diplomatic disaster masked as a strategic realignment. Commodus agreed to terms that were technically favorable. The tribes had to return captives and provide grain. But in reality, the agreement was a capitulation of Roman ambition. By abandoning the plan to annex the territories, Commodus essentially restored the status quo that had caused the war in the first place, allowing the battered tribes time to recover, rearm, and eventually threaten the empire again. Worse still, he initiated a precedent of subsidizing peace. Rome began paying large sums of gold to barbarian chieftains to keep them quiet. To the rank-and-file legionaries, this was a betrayal of the highest order. They were being ordered to walk away from land they had conquered inch by bloody inch, leaving the bones of their comrades behind in soil that would remain barbarian. The murmurs in the ranks were dangerous. The army, usually the bedrock of imperial stability, felt a deep disconnect from their new emperor. They saw a ruler who preferred to buy safety rather than fight for security, signaling a fundamental shift in Roman foreign policy from aggressive expansionism to a defensive, reactive, and ultimately isolationist stance. Commodus returned to Rome in the autumn of 180 A.D., staging a magnificent triumph for a war he had effectively abandoned. The Roman mob, unaware of the strategic blunder committed on the frontier and simply relieved to have their golden prince back in the city, cheered him with rapture. They saw a handsome, athletic youth bringing peace, unaware that this peace was purchased at the cost of the empire's future security. This moment marked the definitive end of the forward defense policy that had protected Rome for centuries. By rejecting the hard work of province building, Commodus signaled to the world that Rome was no longer interested in growing, only in existing. The abandonment of Marcomannia and Sarmatia was the first domino to fall. It told the enemies of Rome that the empire lacked the stomach for prolonged conflict. While the citizens of Rome celebrated the return of the Golden Age, the generals and senators who understood the geopolitical reality watched the procession with dread. They knew that by prioritizing his own comfort over the safety of the state, Commodus had not secured peace. He had merely postponed a catastrophe that would return with a vengeance in the century to come. While the Colosseum roared with the manufactured joy of the games, a far more deadly contest was festering within the silent marble halls of the Palatine Hill. The peace Commodus had purchased on the Danube did not extend to his own household, where the legacy of Marcus Aurelius was being torn apart by sibling rivalry and dynastic ambition. At the center of this gathering storm was Annia Lucilla, the emperor's older sister and the widow of his father's co-emperor, Lucius Verus. Lucilla was a woman accustomed to the highest honors of the state, having held the title of Augusta long before Commodus's wife, Brutia Crispina, arrived on the scene. Stripped of her supreme precedence and forced to walk behind a sister-in-law she viewed as an inferior interloper, Lucilla's jealousy metastasized into political hatred. But this was not merely a domestic dispute over seating arrangements and imperial titles. It was the coalescence of the senatorial elite's growing frustration. They saw in Lucilla a vessel for their grievances, a way to correct the mistake of succession. In the dark corners of aristocratic villas, whispers turned to plans, and plans turned to steel. Lucilla, leveraging her intimate access to the inner circle, recruited a cabal of high-ranking conspirators, including her cousin and lover, fearing that her brother's erratic and indulgent rule would inevitably lead to the ruin of the dynasty she helped represent. The plot culminated in 182 AD, in a moment that would fundamentally alter the psychology of the young emperor and, by extension, the trajectory of the Roman Empire. As Commodus made his way through a narrow, darkened entrance to the amphitheater, the trap was sprung. The assassin chosen for the deed was Claudius Pompeianus Quintianus, a man whose zeal, unfortunately, outpaced his competence. In a display of theatrical stupidity that saved the emperor's life, Quintianus did not strike immediately. Instead, compelled by the dramatic weight of the moment, he brandished his dagger and shouted, "The Senate sends you this!" This delay, brief but fatal, allowed the emperor's bodyguards to react with lightning speed, seizing the assassin before the blade could graze the imperial flesh. The physical threat was neutralized in seconds, but the psychological wound inflicted by those 5 words, "The Senate sends you this," would never heal. It was a declaration of war. In that terrifying instant, the abstraction of political opposition transformed into a literal knife at his throat. Commodus realized that the threats to his life were not the barbarians across the Danube whom he had paid off, but the men in togas who sat in the front rows of the Senate House, the very men his father had spent a lifetime trying to cultivate and respect. The aftermath of the failed assassination was a bloodletting that shattered the illusion of the golden age once and for all. The mercy and philosophical restraint that had characterized the reign of Marcus Aurelius were discarded overnight, replaced by a cold, reactive paranoia. Commodus launched a purge that decimated the upper echelons of Roman society. Quintianus and his immediate accomplices were executed swiftly, but the net was cast much wider. 2 consuls and the innocent son of a legal expert were put to death simply for their proximity to the plotters. As for Lucilla, the sister who had orchestrated her brother's demise, familial bonds offered her only a temporary reprieve from the executioner's blade. She was banished to the island of Capri, a rock of exile that would eventually become her tomb when Commodus later ordered her death. This betrayal by his own blood hardened Commodus's heart against the entire aristocracy. He ceased to view the Senate as a partner in governance, seeing them instead as a nest of vipers waiting for a second chance to strike. He retreated from public administration, isolating himself within a protective shell of sycophants and soldiers. The assassination attempt in 182 AD was the pivotal moment where Commodus the negligent youth died, and Commodus the tyrant was born. With his trust in the Senate irrevocably broken, Commodus turned to the only force he believed could guarantee his survival, the military, specifically the Praetorian Guard. He effectively abdicated the daily responsibilities of ruling the empire, handing the reins of government to Tigidius Perennis, the Praetorian prefect. This was a catastrophic shift in the constitutional reality of Rome. By empowering Perennis, Commodus signaled that the source of imperial authority was no longer the consensus of the Senate and people of Rome, but the naked force of the sword. Perennis, ruthless and efficient, began to run the empire as a personal fiefdom, using the Praetorians to enforce his will and eliminate rivals, seizing their estates to fund the emperor's lavish lifestyle and the guard's loyalty. The Senate was reduced to a rubber stamp, trembling in fear of the next accusation of treason. This reliance on the Praetorian prefect set a dangerous precedent that would haunt Rome for the next century. Commodus had shown that an emperor did not need to be a statesman. He only needed to be a paymaster to his bodyguards. The delicate balance of the principate was destroyed replaced by a military despotism that would eventually devour Commodus himself, and later, the empire he was sworn to protect. With the execution of leading senators and the systematic dismantling of the Stoic opposition, Commodus effectively retired from the business of governing the empire he had inherited. He found the day-to-day administration of justice, the management of grain supplies, and the intricate diplomacy of the frontiers to be tedious distractions from his true passions, the arena, the hunt, and the hedonistic pleasures of his private villas. Into this power vacuum stepped Tigidius Perennis, the Praetorian prefect who had orchestrated the downfall of the previous administration. For 3 years, Perennis was the de facto emperor of Rome, wielding absolute authority, while Commodus indulged in an endless vacation at his estates in Lanuvium. Perennis was a man of undeniable ability, yet his administration was characterized by a ruthless efficiency that prioritized the security of the throne over the rule of law. He understood that to keep Commodus happy and safe, he needed money to pay the legions and the guard, and he acquired this wealth by resurrecting the terror tactics of Nero and Domitian. Wealthy senators were accused of treason on flimsy evidence, their estates confiscated to fill the imperial coffers and line Perennis's own pockets. While Commodus played at being a gladiator, Perennis held the wolf of rebellion by the ears, maintaining a grip on the state that was as firm as it was brutal, creating a bifurcation of power where the man with the title did nothing, and the man with the sword did everything. The accumulation of power by a subordinate is a dangerous game in an autocracy, and Perennis eventually found himself isolated by his own ambition. The unraveling of his regime came from a bizarre and unprecedented event that signaled the breakdown of military discipline. In Britain, the legions had become mutinous, dissatisfied with Perennis's attempts to replace high-ranking senatorial commanders with men of the equestrian order, his own cronies. According to the historian Cassius Dio, the legions in Britain sent a delegation of 1,500 javelin men to Rome, not to fight, but to lodge a complaint. That such a large armed force could march unhindered from the Channel to the capital speaks volumes about the paralysis of the central government. They accused Perennis of plotting to make his own son emperor. Commodus, confronted by these angry soldiers and terrified of a military coup, did what he would always do when threatened. He sacrificed his protector to save his own skin. In a shocking display of ingratitude and cowardice, Commodus surrendered Perennis to the soldiers. The man who had run the empire was stripped, scourged, and executed, along with his wife and sons. The fall of Perennis removed the last vestige of administrative competence from the government. The Praetorian prefect had been a tyrant, yes, but he was a tyrant who understood the machinery of the state. His replacement would usher in an era of corruption so profound it would rot the very foundations of Roman civic life. Following the bloody exit of Perennis, Commodus did not reclaim the reins of power. Instead, he retreated further into his paranoia and pleasure, handing the keys of the empire to a man whose rise to power was an insult to every tradition Rome held dear. This was Marcus Aurelius Cleander, a Phrygian freedman who had once been brought to Rome in chains as a slave to be sold as a pack carrier. Through cunning, charm, and the peculiar dynamics of the imperial household, Cleander had risen to become the trusted chamberlain of the palace. Commodus felt safe with Cleander in a way he never did with the Senate or the generals. Cleander was a creature of the palace, entirely dependent on the emperor's favor for his existence. He posed no dynastic threat, or so Commodus believed. Cleander was given the unprecedented title of Pugio, or dagger, symbolizing his role as the emperor's personal enforcer. But unlike Perennis, who sought power through military control, Cleander viewed the Roman Empire as a personal storefront. He had no interest in governance, borders, or justice. His sole motivation was the accumulation of vast, grotesque wealth. Under Cleander's stewardship, the imperial bureaucracy ceased to function as an administrative body and transformed into an auction house where the assets of the state were sold to the highest bidder. The corruption under Cleander reached levels that would have been comical if they were not so destructive to the empire's integrity. Everything was for sale: seats in the Senate, army commands, provincial governorships, and even verdicts in the law courts. If a man was wealthy enough, he could buy an acquittal for murder. If he was poor, he could be condemned to satisfy a rich enemy. The culmination of this systemic rot was the infamous year 190 AD, which history recalls with a shudder as the year of the 25 consuls. The consulship was the most prestigious office in Rome, a position dating back to the founding of the Republic, traditionally held by two men for a full year to mark the passage of time. Cleander, realizing the immense price men would pay for the honor, began appointing consuls for terms lasting only days or weeks, before forcing them to resign to make room for the next paying customer. By selling the consulship 25 times in a single year, Cleander stripped the office of all dignity and political meaning, reducing it to a vanity title for the nouveau riche. This total commodification of the state eroded the loyalty of the competent civil servants and the military class. They watched as the meritocratic elements of the Roman system were dismantled and replaced by a kleptocracy, where the only qualification for leadership was a heavy purse and a willingness to bribe the emperor's favorite chamberlain. Rome was still standing, but its soul was being pawned off piece by piece. As the administrative machinery of the empire was cannibalized for profit, Commodus retreated further into a psychological fortress of his own making, one where he was not merely a successor to Marcus Aurelius, but a divine entity walking among mortals. The rejection of his father's Stoic philosophy was now absolute. Where Marcus had sought to rule through wisdom and restraint, Commodus sought to rule through myth and brute force. He became obsessed with the demigod Hercules, viewing the hero not just as an idol, but as his literal spiritual counterpart. This was not a subtle political allegory, which was common enough in Roman propaganda, but a profound and dangerous delusion that began to dictate state policy. Commodus began to dress the part in his daily life, shedding the traditional toga of the Roman princeps in favor of a lion skin draped over his shoulders and a heavy wooden club carried in his hand. To the horror of the conservative Senate, the Emperor of Rome walked the halls of the Palatine, attempting to physically embody the laboring hero, effectively erasing the dignity of his office and replacing it with the costume of a stage actor. He ordered statues to be carved depicting him in this guise, fusing his features with the muscular, bearded archetype of the mythological strongman, demanding that the world acknowledge him not as a political leader, but as the Roman Hercules, a savior sent to bludgeon the enemies of the state into submission. This identification with Hercules inevitably led Commodus to the arena, a place where the barrier between the emperor and the spectacle was supposed to remain absolute. For a Roman emperor to descend into the sands and fight as a gladiator was a scandalous breach of social order, an act of *infamia* that degraded the imperial dignity to the level of a slave. Yet Commodus craved the adoration of the mob and the visceral thrill of violence. He styled himself as the greatest fighter of the age, participating in hundreds of bouts, though these contests were far from fair. His opponents, Often skilled gladiators who valued their lives over their pride were armed with wooden weapons or blunted tips, forced to submit to the emperor's blows or face execution. He slaughtered exotic beasts by the thousands, ostriches, lions, and giraffes, displaying his marksmanship from the safety of a specialized enclosure, decapitating running ostriches with crescent-headed arrows to the bewildered cheers of the populace. While the common people were initially entertained by this unprecedented access to their ruler, the senatorial class watched in terrified silence. They saw a man who had completely lost touch with reality, a ruler who believed that the theatrical spilling of blood was the same as military conquest, and who valued the applause of the amphitheater over the security of the frontiers. The emperor's megalomania soon transcended personal dress and gladiatorial games, expanding to consume the very identity of the Roman state. In a decree that signaled the final death of the Augustan Principate, Commodus announced that Rome itself was to be reborn. The eternal city, the asterisk caput mundi asterisk that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, was stripped of its ancient name. Rome was effectively abolished, and in its place stood Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. This was a declaration of ownership. The empire was no longer a public trust, or asterisk res publicus asterisk, but a personal estate of a living god. To ensure this branding was total, he decimated the calendar. The 12 months of the year were renamed to correspond with his 12 adopted names: Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius, and others, ending with Commodus. Every time a Roman citizen wrote a date, signed a contract, or celebrated a birthday, they were forced to speak the emperor's name. The Senate, now thoroughly cowed and purged of dissenters, was renamed the Commodian Senate, and the legions became the Commodian Army. It was a systematic attempt to erase history and restart time with Commodus as the genesis, a level of narcissism that made the excesses of Nero or Caligula seem almost modest by comparison. The visual landscape of the city was aggressively altered to reflect this new theology of the self. The most egregious example of this rebranding was the modification of the Colossus of Nero, the massive bronze statue that stood near the Flavian amphitheater. Originally depicting Nero, and later modified to represent the sun god Sol, Commodus ordered the head to be removed and replaced with his own likeness. He added the attributes of Hercules, the club, and the lion to the statue, and inscribed a new dedication on its base: "To the only left-handed fighter to conquer 12 times 1,000 men." This inscription, celebrating his rigged victories in the arena, was placed on a monument that dominated the city skyline. By forcing the Senate and the people to engage in these rituals of worship, recognizing him as a living deity and the exuperatorius, the Supreme One, Commodus shattered the illusion of the first among equals that had held the empire together since the time of Augustus. He was no longer a magistrate serving the state. He was a tyrant demanding that reality itself bend to his whims. The Roman state had survived bad emperors before, but it had never been asked to completely forfeit its identity to the vanity of a single man. As the year progressed, the disconnect between the emperor's fantasy world and the crumbling reality of the empire grew dangerously wide, setting the stage for the inevitable snapback of reality. The final shattering of Roman dignity occurred not in the palace, but upon the blood-soaked sands of the Flavian amphitheater. For centuries, the emperor of Rome was expected to preside over the games as a distant judicial figure, the ultimate arbiter of life and death, separate from the grime and slaughter of the arena floor. But Commodus obliterated this sacred separation, driven by a pathological need for adulation and a delusional belief in his own Herculean strength, he descended from the imperial box to stand shoulder to shoulder with slaves, criminals, and disgrace. To the Roman elite, this was not merely eccentric, it was a profound religious and social pollution. Gladiators were infamia, social outcasts stripped of all rights and dignity, legally equivalent to prostitutes and actors. By willingly adopting this role, Commodus was not just playing a game. He was theoretically abdicating his social standing as a free citizen, let alone the princeps, effectively debasing the imperial purple in a mixture of gore and sweat that horrified the traditional aristocracy while initially mesmerizing the mob. He was stripping away the divine distance that made the emperor a god, reducing himself to a performer begging for applause in the dust. His exploits began as a *venator*, a hunter of beasts, though to call these displays hunts would be a generous exaggeration of the term. The logistical machinery of the empire was repurposed to strip the provinces of their most exotic wildlife, shipping thousands of lions, leopards, elephants, and hippopotamuses to Rome, solely to serve as stationary targets for the emperor's vanity. Commodus preferred to kill from safety, utilizing a specially constructed raised platform that encircled the arena, allowing him to rain down arrows and javelins without ever risking a mauling. The historian Herodian recounts the sheer volume of the slaughter, noting that 100 lions were killed in a single session, their bodies left to rot in the sun until they could be dragged away by slaves. Yet, the spectacle often veered into the absurd and the grotesque, rather than the heroic. In one infamous display, Commodus used specially designed crescent-headed arrows to decapitate ostriches as they ran at full speed, a feat of marksmanship that was undeniably impressive, but deeply unsettling to the onlookers who watched the headless birds continue to run around the arena, a macabre circus act performed by the most powerful man on earth. When he tired of slaughtering animals, Commodus turned his attention to human opponents, styling himself as the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought as a secutor, heavily armored and wielding a short sword, entering the arena hundreds of times to the roar of a confused and terrified populace. These bouts, however, were nothing more than elaborate, deadly theater. While Commodus fought with lethal steel blades, his opponents, often highly skilled gladiators who could have easily dispatched the untrained emperor, were forced to wield weapons made of lead or soft wood. They knew that to strike the emperor was to invite immediate execution, and so they participated in a humiliating pantomime of combat, inevitably surrendering so that Commodus could claim a glorious victory. Worse still, the emperor charged the Roman treasury a staggering fee for every appearance. He demanded 1,000,000 sestertii for each bout, effectively holding the state ransom to pay for his own hobby. This was not the generosity of a patron giving games to his people. It was the extortion of a tyrant bleeding the state dry to play dress-up in the guise of a slave, transferring the wealth of the empire into his own private accounts to fund further debauchery. For the Senate, attendance at these games was not optional. It was a mandatory exercise in terror and humiliation. They were forced to sit in their designated rows and shout specific scripted accolades to the emperor standing in the bloodied sand below. "You are the Lord. You are the first of all men most fortunate. You occupy the empire. You are the victor," they chanted, their voices trembling with the knowledge that spies were watching their every expression. The historian Cassius Dio, who was present in the senators' seats during these events, recorded the sheer absurdity of this situation. He recalls a moment when Commodus, having just killed an ostrich, walked over to the senatorial section grinning wildly and waved the bird's severed bloody head at them while gesturing with his sword, a silent, terrifying threat that signaled he could do the same to them. Dio admits that the scene was so ludicrous that he was overcome with a desperate urge to laugh. To stop himself from giggling and subsequently being executed, he began chewing on the laurel leaves from his wreath, urging the senators sitting near him to do the same, transforming the governing body of Rome into a row of frightened men chewing foliage to survive the madness of their king. The psychological impact of the gladiator emperor on the Roman psyche cannot be overstated. While the lower classes initially cheered the novelty of an emperor who shared their lowbrow tastes, the sheer scale of the financial ruin eventually soured even the mob. The plebeian games, traditionally a time of free entertainment and largesse, had become a mechanism for bankruptcy. Commodus was spending the equivalent of entire provincial tax revenues on a few weeks of spectacle. He depleted the vast surplus left by his father, Marcus Aurelius, and began seizing the estates of wealthy citizens on trumped-up charges of treason simply to fund the acquisition of more animals and more gladiatorial armor. The sanctity of the office was gone. By stepping into the arena, Commodus had erased the mystique of the imperial cult. He was no longer a distant god to be revered. He was a sweaty, bloody performer demanding applause. The barrier between the ruler and the ruled had dissolved, leaving behind a naked tyranny that was rapidly running out of money, friends, and time. While the emperor played gladiator in the arena, the bedrock of Roman stability, its economy, was beginning to crumble under the weight of his extravagance. The spectacles, the bribes to the Praetorian Guard, and the hush money paid to the Danubian tribes required vast sums of liquid capital that the treasury simply did not possess. To bridge the gap between his lavish spending and the state's revenues, Commodus resorted to a disastrous expedient that would haunt the empire for generations: debasement. He reduced the weight of the silver denarius and diluted its purity, lowering the silver content from around 79% to 72%, the most significant drop since the reign of Nero. This was not merely a technical adjustment, it was a theft of value from every citizen in the empire. By mixing base metals like copper into the silver coinage, Commodus could mint more coins with the same amount of precious metal, momentarily flushing the economy with cash to pay his soldiers and suppliers. However, this short-sighted policy triggered immediate inflation. Merchants, realizing the coins were worth less, demanded more of them for the same goods. The purchasing power of the average Roman plummeted, and the complex trade networks that spanned the Mediterranean began to shudder under the strain of a currency that could no longer be trusted. The Golden Age was effectively being melted down, mixed with copper, and spent on exotic beasts and cheers. The economic fragility created by currency manipulation was exacerbated by a far more visceral crisis: the breakdown of the annona, the state-sponsored grain dole that fed the population of Rome. By the year 189 AD, the specter of famine had returned to the capital, but this was not solely the result of poor harvests or storms at sea. It was a catastrophe manufactured by political rivalry. The administration of the empire had fallen largely into the hands of Cleander, the emperor's powerful freedman chamberlain, who had risen to become the de facto ruler of Rome, while Commodus indulged in his hedonistic retreat at the suburban villa of the Quintilii. However, Cleander had enemies, chief among them Papirius Dionysius, the prefect of the Annona. In a cynical power play that displayed a total disregard for human life, Dionysius deliberately withheld existing grain stocks from the market. His objective was brutal and simple: to artificially create a famine so severe that the starving populace would blame Cleander for their misery. The strategy worked with terrifying efficiency. As the price of bread skyrocketed and children began to die in the Subura, the whispers in the bread lines turned from complaints about the weather to accusations against the slave master Cleander, who was rumored to be hoarding grain for his own profit while the city starved. The tension reached its breaking point in 190 AD during a horse race at the Circus Maximus. The massive stadium, usually a venue for the emperor to distract the masses with entertainment, transformed into a cauldron of political dissent. As the chariots rounded the spina, a chant began in the cheap seats and quickly engulfed the entire arena. The people were no longer cheering for the greens or the blues. They were screaming for bread and demanding the head of Cleander. This was not a disorganized riot, but a unified movement of a desperate populace. Emboldened by their sheer numbers, the mob surged out of the Circus Maximus. They did not disperse to their homes, but instead formed a massive column that marched out of the city proper. They headed straight for the villa of the Quintilii on the Via Appia, where Commodus was residing, sheltered from the suffering of his capital. It was a terrifying spectacle. Tens of thousands of starving Romans marching miles into the suburbs, driven by a singular murderous intent. They were coming to confront their emperor, tearing down the veil of distance he had placed between himself and the consequences of his negligence. When the mob reached the imperial villa, the situation devolved into open warfare. Cleander, terrified for his life and wielding the authority of the praetorian prefect, ordered the imperial horse guards to charge the unarmed crowd. The cavalry swept into the mass of protesters, trampling and slashing, turning the Via Appia into a slaughterhouse. However, the violence did not break the mob's resolve. It hardened it. In a stunning turn of events, the urban cohorts, the soldiers tasked with policing the city and who lived among the people, turned against the imperial horse guards, siding with the mob. A mini-civil war erupted at the gates of the emperor's sanctuary. Inside the villa, Commodus remained oblivious, shielded by Cleander and his inner circle, who feared telling him the truth. It was only when his sister, Fadila, or perhaps his mistress, Marcia, burst into his chambers with torn clothes and a terrified demeanor, that the emperor grasped the reality. His own troops were fighting one another, and a murderous army of citizens was moments away from storming his palace. Panic seized Commodus. With zero hesitation and a total lack of loyalty, he summoned Cleander. To save his own skin, the emperor ordered the immediate execution of his favorite minister. Cleander's head was severed and thrown to the bloodthirsty crowd outside, a gruesome offering that instantly quelled the riot. The mob cheered Commodus as a savior, unaware that I had just taught him a dangerous lesson. Loyalty was disposable, and violence was the only language the city understood. The lesson Commodus learned from the execution of Cleander was not one of humility, but of absolute paranoid self-preservation. By late 192 AD, the emperor's behavior had spiraled into pure megalomania. He had resolved to ring in the new year not as a statesman or a soldier, but as a gladiator, intending to march from the gladiatorial barracks rather than the imperial palace, a blasphemous break from tradition that disgusted the Roman elite. To secure this transition, he planned a purge that would eliminate the last voices of reason within his inner circle. Fate, however, intervened in the form of a child's plaything. Tradition holds that a favorite page boy of the emperor found a writing tablet Commodus had carelessly left on his bed while bathing. The boy, thinking it a toy, brought it to Marcia, Commodus's influential Christian mistress, and as she scanned the wax, the blood drained from her face. It was a proscription list, a death warrant for the very people keeping the empire functioning. The chamberlain Eclectus, the praetorian prefect, Quintus Aemilius Laetus, and Marcia herself. They were to be slaughtered to pave the way for Commodus's gladiatorial fantasy. Realizing that their loyalty had been repaid with a death sentence, Marcia summoned Eclectus and Laetus. The trio, the three most powerful people in the palace, understood immediately that the sun would not rise on another day for both them and the emperor. The plot was formed instantly. They would strike on New Year's Eve. The conspiracy relied on intimacy and trust, weapons that Marcia wielded with terrifying precision. On the evening of December 31st, 192 A.D., the palace was alive with the anticipation of the festival of Saturnalia and the coming new year, providing the perfect cover for a quiet assassination. The plan was classic in its Roman simplicity: poison. Marcia, who had administered the emperor's food and drink for years, prepared a cup of wine, some sources say a piece of fine beef, laced with a potent toxin. Commodus, thirsty from his exertions and oblivious to the betrayal, consumed the offering without hesitation. The conspirators waited in the shadows, expecting a quick and silent death that they could attribute to a stroke or heart failure. However, the emperor's legendary indulgences ironically saved him temporarily, having eaten and drunk heavily throughout the day. His stomach rejected the poison. Commodus began to vomit violently, expelling the toxin before it could stop his heart. As he stumbled away to his bath to cleanse himself and recover, panic seized Marcia, Laetus, and Eclectus. They knew that if Commodus survived the night and realized he had been poisoned, the retribution would be agonizingly slow and encompass everyone they had ever known. They had crossed the Rubicon of treason, and there was no turning back. The poison had failed, so they turned to brute force. In their desperation, the conspirators summoned Narcissus, a professional wrestler who served as Commodus's personal trainer and sparring partner. Narcissus was a man of immense physical strength, one of the few people allowed close physical contact with the emperor, and he held his own grievances against the tyrant. Promise of rich rewards and likely his own survival motivated him to finish what the poison could not. He entered the bathhouse where Commodus lay soaking, trying to settle his heaving stomach. The scene was devoid of the grandeur of the Senate or the roar of the Colosseum. It was intimate, quiet, and brutal. Under the guise of massaging the emperor or assisting him, Narcissus moved in. With the efficiency of a trained killer, he seized Commodus by the throat. There were no guards to save the man who called himself the Roman Hercules. The god was helpless against the grip of a mortal athlete. In the steamy silence of the caldarium, the Pax Romana was strangled out of existence. Commodus struggled briefly, splashing the water, but weakened by the poison and overpowered by Narcissus, he was quickly asphyxiated. The man who had dreamed of ruling Rome as a reincarnated deity died naked and alone on the floor of his own bathroom, ending the Antonine Dynasty not with a war, but with a sordid domestic murder. When news of the emperor's death reached the Senate before dawn on January 1st, 193 A.D., the reaction was not mourning, but an explosion of cathartic rage and jubilation. The fear that had paralyzed the aristocracy for over a decade evaporated in an instant, replaced by a vindictive desire to erase Commodus from history entirely. The Senate convened immediately and issued a decree of damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory. This was the ultimate Roman sanction. His statues were torn down and smashed. His name was chiseled off public monuments, and his acts were declared void. The Senate hall echoed with shouts calling for his body to be dragged by a hook through the streets and thrown into the Tiber like a common criminal, a fate usually reserved for murderers and traitors. While the new emperor-designate Pertinax would eventually intervene to allow a quiet burial to appease the Praetorian Guard, the psychological verdict was rendered. The Senate believed they had cut out the cancer and saved the state, unaware that by sanctifying the murder of an emperor, they had merely opened the floodgates. The Golden Age was officially over, and the year of the 5 emperors was about to begin in blood. The immediate aftermath of Commodus's assassination was not the restoration of the Republic, but a desperate scramble to prevent anarchy that ultimately revealed just how fragile the Roman state had become. The conspirators had selected Publius Helvius Pertinax, the urban prefect and a highly respected former general, to take the purple. Pertinax was everything Commodus was not: disciplined, frugal, and deeply committed to the old senatorial virtues. However, he inherited an empire that was financially destitute, its treasury emptied by years of gladiatorial games and sycophantic payouts. To stabilize the economy, Pertinax immediately imposed strict austerity measures, selling off Commodus's luxury possessions, including his concubines and jesters, to pay the soldiers' wages. But his fatal error lay in his treatment of the Praetorian Guard. Having grown fat and entitled under the lax discipline of the previous regime, the guards expected massive cash donatives in exchange for their loyalty. When Pertinax not only refused to pay the exorbitant sums they demanded, but also attempted to impose strict disciplinary reforms to curb their abuse of power, the relationship between the emperor and his protectors turned toxic. In the eyes of the Praetorians, Pertinax was not a savior restoring dignity to Rome, but a miserly old man threatening their privileged existence. The tension reached its breaking point on March 28, 193 A.D., a mere 87 days into Pertinax's reign. A contingent of 300 disgruntled soldiers from the Praetorian Guard marched on the imperial palace, not with a strategic plan for a coup, but in a spontaneous eruption of greed and rage. The palace staff, sensing the shifting winds, abandoned their posts, allowing the mutineers to storm the inner sanctum unopposed. Rather than fleeing or hiding, Pertinax displayed the stoic courage of a true Roman commander. He confronted the assassins, attempting to reason with them and reminding them of their sworn oaths to the state. For a brief, breathless moment, his gravity and authority awed the soldiers into silence, and it seemed as though order might be restored through words alone. But the spell was broken when a Tungrian soldier struck the emperor with a lance, crying out that the soldiers had sent him a sword. The mob descended, butchering Pertinax and mounting his head on a pike to be paraded back to their camp. This was a pivotal, irreversible moment in Roman history. The Praetorians had learned that they could murder a reigning emperor with impunity, a realization that would strip the office of its sanctity and plunge the empire into a cycle of violence from which it would never fully recover. What followed the murder of Pertinax remains one of the most disgraceful episodes in the history of the Roman Empire, an event that historian Edward Gibbon described as the moment Rome was put up for auction. With the throne vacant and the Senate paralyzed by fear, the Praetorians withdrew to their fortified camp and made a shocking announcement. The position of emperor would be given to the man who could pay the highest bribe. Two bidders emerged in this grotesque marketplace. The first was Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, the city prefect and father-in-law of the slain Pertinax, who sought to buy the loyalty of his predecessor's murderers. The second was Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator with a questionable reputation who rushed to the camp's walls to outbid him. As the soldiers shouted offers back and forth between the ramparts and the ground below, the price for the Roman world climbed higher and higher. Sulpicianus offered 20,000 sestertii per soldier, but Julianus, desperate and ambitious, raised the bid by a massive margin, offering 25,000 sestertii to every single guardsman. The Praetorians, fearing that Sulpicianus might seek revenge for Pertinax's death, accepted Julianus's offer. The gates were opened, and the highest bidder was hailed as emperor, having purchased the sovereignty of the world like a common commodity in a bazaar. The news of the auction traveled slowly, but struck with the force of a thunderbolt once it reached the frontiers. While the Praetorian Guard believed they held the sole power to make emperors, the vast provincial armies, who endured the hardships of border defense while the guards lived in luxury in Rome, were incensed. The legions felt a deep sense of professional jealousy and moral outrage. If the throne was for sale, why should the pampered garrison in Rome keep the profits? The auctioning of the empire shattered the illusion of central authority, creating an immediate power vacuum that three powerful governors rushed to fill. In Britain, Clodius Albinus commanded the loyalty of the Western legions. In the east, Pescennius Niger was proclaimed emperor by the armies of Syria. But it was on the Danube frontier, the closest to Italy, that the most dangerous contender arose. Septimius Severus, a ruthless and pragmatic commander, gathered his troops and painted himself not as a usurper, but as the avenger of the honorable Pertinax. He secured the loyalty of 16 legions, a force that dwarfed the Praetorian Guard, and began a lightning-fast march toward Rome. The year of the 5 emperors had begun, and the civil war that ensued would mobilize the full destructive power of the Roman military against itself, marking the true beginning of the military anarchy that would define the coming century. Upon entering the Eternal City in June of 193 A.D., Septimius Severus wasted no time in demonstrating that the rules of power had irrevocably changed. His first act was a masterstroke of cold political theater that signaled the death of the old principate. He summoned the Praetorian Guard, the very men who had murdered Pertinax, and auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, to a parade outside the city walls, ostensibly to receive a donative. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by Severus's loyal Danubian legions, spears leveled and swords drawn. In a single stroke, Severus stripped them of their weapons, their ornate uniforms, and their status, banishing them from Rome on pain of death. To replace them, he did not recruit from the aristocratic youth of Italy as tradition dictated. Rather, he filled the ranks of a new doubled Praetorian Guard with the toughest soldiers from his own provincial legions. This was a profound symbolic and physical shift. Rome was no longer the master of the legions, but a captive of them. The center of gravity had shifted from the Senate House to the military camp, and the emperor was no longer a first citizen managing the state, but a warlord occupying his own capital. Securing Rome was merely the prologue to a bloody saga of consolidation that would bleed the empire white. Severus faced rival claimants who commanded their own massive armies: Pescennius Niger in the east and Clodius Albinus in the west. The resulting civil wars were titanic struggles that pitted the flower of the Roman military against itself, wasting manpower that was desperately needed on the frontiers. The conflict culminated in 197 A.D. at the Battle of Lugdunum in Gaul, likely the largest battle ever fought between Roman armies, involving perhaps 150,000 men. Severus emerged the victor, but the cost was astronomical. Thousands of Rome's best soldiers lay dead, killed not by barbarians, but by the ambition of their commanders. By ruthlessly crushing his rivals, Severus achieved total power, but he did so by shattering the illusion of consensus that had held the empire together during the Pax Romana. He ruled now by right of conquest alone. To underscore his absolute authority and his contempt for the Senate's previous decrees, he even forced the Senate to deify Commodus, the very man they had condemned, branding himself the son of Marcus Aurelius and the brother of Commodus, to fabricate a dynastic legitimacy that bypassed the Senate entirely. Under the Severan dynasty, the Senate was reduced from a governing partner to a terrified administrative bureau. Severus made little effort to hide his disdain for the aristocracy, viewing them as potential conspirators rather than peers. Following his victory over Albinus, he initiated a brutal purge, executing 29 senators and confiscating their vast estates to fill the imperial treasury. This influx of wealth allowed him to bypass the Senate's control over finances completely, making the emperor solely responsible for the economic state of the realm. The age of the philosopher king was over. This was the dawn of the military autocrat. Severus appointed army officers to high civilian administrative posts, effectively militarizing the government bureaucracy. The Senate's approval, once a crucial stamp of legitimacy, became a meaningless rubber stamp. Severus did not govern through the consent of the aristocracy, but through the blunt instrument of force, creating a centralized authoritarian apparatus that foreshadowed the dominate of the later empire. The Republic was a distant memory. The empire was now the personal property of the soldier emperor. To maintain this military autocracy, Severus had to ensure the unwavering loyalty of the legions, and he did so with the only currency that mattered to them: gold and privilege. He raised the annual pay of the legionaries from 300 to 500 denarii, the first substantial raise the army had seen in over a century. Furthermore, he lifted the ban on marriage for soldiers, allowing them to live with their families near their bases, a move that improved morale but anchored the legions to specific regions, eroding their strategic mobility. While these measures secured his throne in the short term, they sowed the seeds of economic ruin. To fund the ballooning military budget, Severus drastically debased the currency, reducing the silver purity of the denarius by nearly 50%. This triggered a cycle of inflation that would spiral out of control in the decades to follow. By tying the emperor's survival directly to his ability to pay an increasingly avaricious soldiery, Severus created a monster. He established a precedent where loyalty was a transaction, not a duty, setting the stage for an era where emperors would be made and unmade based solely on the size of their donatives. The end of Septimius Severus came not in Rome, but on the rugged frontier of Britannia in 211 A.D., where he had gone to wage one last campaign to conquer Scotland. Worn down by gout and years of relentless campaigning, he lay dying in Eboracum, leaving the empire to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, brothers whose mutual hatred was so intense that they lived in divided sections of the palace and maintained separate guards. As the founder of a new dynasty, Severus understood clearly the precarious nature of the power he had built. His final advice to his sons was stark, cynical, and utterly prophetic, encapsulating the transformation he had wrought upon the Roman world. He whispered, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others." With these words, the facade of the Pax Romana was officially stripped away. The state no longer existed to serve the gods, the people, or the law. It existed to feed the army. Severus passed into history, leaving behind a militarized machine that his sons were ill-equipped to control, and a maxim that would drive the empire headlong into the chaos of the 3rd century. Severus's cynical deathbed advice was not born in a vacuum. It was the inevitable, grim conclusion of the precedent set by Commodus years earlier. When Commodus abandoned the stoic duties of his father, Marcus Aurelius, to play the gladiator, he shattered the illusion that the emperor was the first citizen or a servant of the state. He revealed the naked, terrifying truth that power in Rome rested solely on the blade. Severus merely codified what Commodus had demonstrated, that the Senate was irrelevant, the people were spectators, and the legions were the only constituency that mattered. This shift was catastrophic and irreversible. By turning the empire into a military dictatorship to survive the civil wars of 193 AD, the Severan dynasty locked Rome into a cycle of extortion. The soldiers now knew their strength, and like a wild beast that has tasted blood, they could no longer be domesticated. Every emperor following Commodus sat on a throne held up by spear points, fully aware that a single missed payment or a perceived slight to the troops would result in their assassination. The Pax Romana, that golden age of relative stability where law governed power, had been replaced by the law of the strongest, a dynamic that would bleed the empire dry. The rot instigated by Commodus extended far beyond the palace walls and into the very economic and political marrow of the empire. To pay for the bribes and the lavish games Commodus adored, and later to sustain the massive military pay raises Severus implemented to keep his throne, the Roman currency was systematically debased. The silver content of the denarius plummeted, triggering hyperinflation that would eventually paralyze trade networks and wipe out the savings of the middle class. The psychological infrastructure of the state collapsed alongside the economy. Under the Antonines, the Senate had maintained a dignity and administrative function that provided continuity, a buffer against tyranny. Commodus, through his purges and his public mockery of traditional institutions, transformed the Senate into a terrified rubber stamp assembly. By the time the crisis of the 3rd century fully erupted in 235 AD, the political class had been hollowed out, leaving no one competent to steer the ship when the military strongmen began tearing each other apart. The institutions that had weathered the madness of Caligula and Nero were finally broken, not by the erraticism of the ruler alone, but by the systemic dismantling of their legitimacy that began the moment Commodus stepped into the arena. The direct result of this institutional vandalism was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year nightmare that nearly erased the Roman Empire from history. Following the assassination of Severus Alexander, the last of the dynasty that rose from Commodus's ashes, Rome descended into absolute anarchy. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire saw over 20 emperors rise and fall, most reigning for only a few months before being murdered by their own troops. The frontiers, neglected during the internal power struggles ignited by Commodus, finally broke. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube, while the Sassanid Persians hammered the east, capturing a Roman emperor alive for the first time in history. Cities built walls for the first time in centuries, shrinking in fear, transforming the open, confident urban centers of the Pax Romana into medieval fortresses. This was the world Commodus bequeathed to posterity, a fractured, terrified collection of provinces where the only law was violence. The unity of the Mediterranean, forged over centuries, fractured into breakaway empires in Gaul and Palmyra, proving that the center could no longer hold. The year of the 5 emperors had been a warning. The crisis was the fulfillment of that dark prophecy. In the end, the tragedy of Commodus is not merely the story of a tyrant, but a stark lesson on the fragility of civilization itself. The Pax Romana was a delicate ecosystem balanced on the integrity of the succession and the mutual respect between the ruler, the army, and the law. It took Marcus Aurelius a lifetime of stoic duty to maintain it, but it took his son less than a decade to dismantle it irreparably. Commodus proved that a single failed transition of power, a single generation of negligence and narcissism, is enough to undo centuries of progress. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day. It survived for centuries more in the East and limped on in the West, but it was never the same. The optimistic, expansive, and relatively orderly world of the 2nd century died with Commodus in that bathhouse. He left behind a legacy of blood and iron, replacing the philosopher king with the soldier emperor and trading the peace of Rome for a perpetual state of war. The year 193 AD was the turning point. The moment the sun set on the Golden Age, leaving the Western world to stumble blindly into the long dark twilight of the coming ages.